recorded, but since I'm the only one talking, it shouldn't be a problem. And my colleague Jackie will probably hit the record button at some point. I'd like to welcome you all. We're going to start reasonably on time. There are still a number of people coming in. This will be a session about MIM 2016 Service Pack 1. I will show you my agenda and we'll get started. All right, so what we plan to talk about, I'm just going to quickly summarize what MIM 2016 does, because we're talking about a delta here and we need to understand what we already have. And then, of course, we'll go through the features of Service Pack 1. There are a few things coming up in the near future on top of XP1 that aren't there yet, and I think it's going to be interesting for you to know that, so we'll talk about that briefly. And then just a quick note about some upcoming events I'd like you to be aware of. So we'll deal with that. As far as questions are concerned, do type your questions into the questions dialog box or whatever we call it these days, and I'll try and keep an eye on it. There will be time for some formal questions at the end, probably, although I have to catch a flight at some point this evening. But it is the advantage of working in an airport that the plane comes to me and collects me, which is nice. I'm actually at an airport in a meeting room, which is like a bit echoey. Should anybody charge into the meeting room and shout at me in German, I apologize in advance, but I'll try and keep that to a minimum. All right, so here we go. Let's just talk quickly about what components we already have for Microsoft Identity and Access. I will ask you in a moment where you are at, but as far as Microsoft Identity Manager is concerned, we have a variety of components that I'll just quickly run through. So our service and portal handle the workflows and approvals and present us with a user interface. Many customers and also SIs like ourselves have replacement UI for the portal talking to the MIM web service. So there are a variety of user interface solutions out there, but the web service and its Microsoft released portal provide us with at least administrative UI and to some extent user self-service UI. Then we have the synchronization service, which handles the data pumping and also data transformation and password sync. We have certificate management components, we have reporting components, there is a roles engine, which out of the box is Behold, and new and rather exciting, and one of the major themes of this evening will be afternoon, is privileged access management, and I've got a whole separate slide about what that is. But it's a new feature with MIM that we didn't have back in the FIM days, which comes to life when we start using it with Windows Server 2016, and I'll be talking about that because it's all of current interest since Server 2016 is now general availability. It's worth mentioning is your Active Directory, the cloud equivalent of Active Directory. It also has a bunch of identity and access management functions wrapped around it, and any of you who might be using a hybrid scenario, using both on-premise and cloud Active Directories, will be interested in synchronizing between the two and maintaining consistency between your on-premise and cloud Active Directories. So that's kind of a background. If anybody's got any questions about that, do feel free to ask. There won't be time to go into detail on stuff we aren't talking about in Service Pack 1. Having mentioned that, then, I will present to you with some interaction. I just want to ask you what platform you're currently using so that I could just get a feeling for it. Those of you who are here, perhaps you could quickly respond to this poll. Give me a feeling for the room, as we comedians say. Traditionally, I'll close the poll when about 80% of you have voted, or 85%. So. All right. What about there? Okay. So I'm seeing around about 55% of you still on some version of FIM, 30% on MIM, and about 15% on either other or none. So it gives me an idea. So some of you, the 15% of you might need at some point more detail on what we're talking about around MIM. As I say, we won't be going into it this evening, but do feel free to contact me for more information. There's plenty of material I can point you to help you get up to speed with that. Okay, so those of you on the FIM side of things, you may or may not be aware of the privileged access side of things unless you attended my previous webinars on the subject. However, I'll close the poll. Thank you for that. And you'll get my slide back. Okay, so let's move swiftly on to the features in Service Pack 1. Some of you may have seen this slide or a variation of it before. This was used by Microsoft in the pre-release phase to discuss the upcoming features, broadly speaking. So this is broadly what we're going to be talking about. Of course, I'm going to dive into some detail on each one of them. And so that's what we're going to do next. So as with any Service Pack, there are bug fixes in it. It is a roll-up since RTM. In other words, all the bug fixes in any hotfix that we've had on MIM are in here. I've just listed them here for your information. This recording will be available, and I think the slides will be made available too. So the knowledge base article numbers are there for you to go and find them if you're interested. I picked out some things that interested me in each of the hotfixes. That's not an exhaustive list, of course. Your mileage will probably vary what you find interesting. So anyway, that you get a bunch of fixes, particularly extensible connectivity management agent fixes in the first hotfix. PAM was really addressed in the second, and certificate management in the third. The annoying error message about performance counters not being available was fixed more recently. So SP1 version 4.4.1237. A couple of PAM issues are fixed, nothing particularly earth-shattering, and an image format validation. The images that you upload, so snapshots of my beautiful face, for example, they're checked to check that they are a valid image format and not just some binary value that may or may not be able to be used. So that's handy, but again, not particularly earth-shattering at that stage. But clearly, bug fixes are important, and that's what we get. So step one. We get support for modern platforms. The key thing I think many of you have been waiting for is the browser support. So the MIM portals, these are the MIM primary portal and the password portals now run in what they're calling all major browsers. There is a list of the browsers that they mentioned in one place or the other. The blog mentions Firefox specifically, the blog that talked about releasing this, but it doesn't appear to be specifically in the documentation that lists the supported platforms. It does work in Firefox. I'm trying to clear up with Microsoft whether it's a deliberate omission from the documentation or just a mistake that it's not mentioned. So we can now deliver MIM services via the standard portals on a variety of platforms that was not straightforward before. So that's a good thing. In case any of you are trying this out, there is an issue with Internet Explorer that people have reported. It's not really an issue. You get some slightly weird effects with Internet Explorer 11. The first time you use it, some of the time you get repeated text down the screen. If you clear your browser history and try it again, that normally fixes it, just for those of you who might try this out. As far as the platform is concerned, so 2016 versions of the server, Windows Server itself, SQL Server, and SharePoint. CM and Behold, so certificate management and Behold, the role management part, have not been updated to these. So they're still supported on the 2012 Windows Server and 2014 SQL Server platforms. So that's kind of a little bit weird with the split support there, but that's the way it is. SharePoint 2016 is supported for the portal platform. This is interesting, because some people have SharePoint 2016 and want to use it. If you don't have 2016 but you want to use modern technology, you will be aware, or you may be aware, there is no foundation version of SharePoint 2016, although there's no free version. We're kind of used to getting free SharePoint to run MIM and FIM on, and to my request for information on this, I understand, at least at the moment, there is no licensing agreement for us to use SharePoint 2016 with FIM or MIM. So if you have licenses, you can use it with SharePoint 2016. If you don't want to buy SharePoint 2016 licenses, you'll still be using SharePoint 2013 Foundation, which is still supported for MIM, and that would be the advice to continue to use that. Matthew Stevenson asked a question before we started about the availability or otherwise of claims-based authentication, which might be a reason to use a modern platform. But since we don't currently have claims-based authentication for MIM still on Kerberos, that is less of an issue than it might be. So those are the updates. So Windows 10 Client is supported for the add-ins, for the password reset add-in and the Outlook add-in on Windows 10. There's the link for the full documentation of platform support. So good modern platforms, generally speaking, and suddenly open to non-Windows platforms with additional browser support. So that's a good deal. So some other parts of the update affect PAMs. This is Privileged Access Management. To understand remotely what they're talking about, I just wanted to have one slide on PAM. Some of you won't have come across this before. This is the idea that we assume that our production domain has been compromised, which we're noting here as our corp domain. So we're assuming that there's malware out there just waiting to listen for password hashes, in particular, and steal password hashes when the time has come for the attack, and start the usual process of attacking, which involves moving sideways to other computers, stealing elevated permissions, and trying to elevate all the way to domain admin, at which point we've lost. So the idea of privileged access management in this construct is that we will implement a new, clean, separate, and hygienic domain, sometimes known as the bastion domain, often referred to as the priv or privileged domain. So we implement a separate domain, and from this we'll get just-in-time administration. So we'll get the ability to provide only candidates to, let's say, the domain admin role. In other words, we have no domain admins in Corp until they need to be domain admins. In other words, the domain admins of today become merely candidate admins. In other words, they're not admins. They will go to the priv environment when they need to be a domain admin. They will escalate their account and they will become a domain admin for a period of time. This is the concept of just-in-time admin. Their credentials remain in priv. They will access corporate resources from a priv workstation. Their priv credentials remain in priv, and they'll use a one-way trust and SID history to access the resources in Corp that they previously were administering. So that's the 1-minute summary of what PAM does in the initial release. I will address the PAM question I just got shortly. As far as deploying to an existing SharePoint 2016 farm, you can create your site collection on an existing farm if you want to, absolutely. As far as migrating the users to a new domain for PAM, this actually is kind of the next point. So, well, the second next point. The first point is that we have deployment scripts. Those of you who might want to try out priv, there's a certain amount of stuff to install. You need to install a whole new AD forest. You need to configure some permissions in the Corp domain. You'll need to set up a SQL server, probably with high availability. You'll need to set up some SharePoint, probably with load balancing. You'll need to set up MIM itself, set up some trusts, and so on. You can see the list of things you need to do there. There are scripts, PowerShell scripts, which you can download to help you deploy. It's not a point and shoot and forget issue. You'll have to do some pre-configuration. You'll have to provide the VMs or the servers that you plan to install on. You'll have to copy installation binaries for whatever part you're trying to install. So you have to prepare yourself. There's some good documentation which you should read, and there's a little bit of manual intervention. Some of the wizard steps of, for example, the SharePoint installation are not automatable, or at least not readily, and therefore you just have to click next, next, and finish a couple of times to get through it. But we had a hand in developing these, so we did maybe the first half of it. Microsoft did the second half of it. So there are some comments from some of you guys in there. So it's interesting, useful. It does quite a lot of hardening, so it sets up policies, audit policies, permissions to authentication silos and policies. So it does quite a lot of hard work that you might not think of if you were just sort of installing and following a setup wizard. So I thoroughly recommend that you do use the deployment scripts if you're planning to deploy PAM, because they are configured to do it in a best practice manner. So this kind of goes to the question that anyone asked right there. So in Service Pack 1, we are now equipped with fully supported single domain deployment for PAM. So this is sometimes known as priv only. Normally, what you would do, and I'll just step back a slide or two actually because this picture is useful. Normally what you would do when you're deploying is you'd have a corporate user who is currently a domain admin in Corp. So they would have a membership of some security group on the red side. And you'd be using script and you create a new user in priv for that user. Not to replace, but to enhance that user. So you get a second account and you create a copy of the security group, a clone effectively with its SID then in SID history into the priv domain. So yes, you are making copies of existing objects into the priv domain so that they can be used in that priv environment in a segregated and secure fashion. That, however, meant that if you wanted to manage the groups, for example, domain admins, in the priv domain itself, you had a problem because you didn't have a group to copy. The priv domain admins group exists already. So we needed these, I'll step forward again, we needed these single domain options. It basically means that you run the PowerShell scripts to create objects in privileged access management using a priv only switch. This means I am deploying PAM effectively in its own domain. In other words, I want to manage the groups in the same domain as PAM is installed in. Now we refer to this as single domain or priv only deployment because it's really only intended for the priv domain itself. There are people who've asked questions in the past, can I install PAM in my Corp domain? And the answer is, well, you can. You can install PAM in the Corp domain using the priv only switch, but it's not regarded as secure for the fairly obvious reason that we've assumed that our Corp domain is compromised and therefore our priv credentials would be equally available for compromise. So it's certainly not as the creator intended to install PAM into our Corp environment. We're intending to install it into our priv environment, and what priv only is intended to do is to give us protection for the privileged domain admin objects. In other words, the domain admins, enterprise admins in the priv domain itself. And we use priv only as true on all of the relevant PowerShell commands. Okay, so this is single domain deployment. It's really a tweak to the PowerShell commands so they don't assume that you have to create a new object when you're implementing a user as a privileged user, because they may already exist if you're in the same domain as you're starting from. So I hope that answers the question about do we need to migrate user to new domain. You'd never need to migrate the user. You might need to copy it if you're kind of mirroring a corporate user, but you don't even need to do that if you're mirroring a user who's already present in the priv domain. So that's the subject of, you're welcome. So that's the subject of single domain deployment. Useful, certainly useful because it was kind of weird that we couldn't do just-in-time admin in the privileged domain itself when we could do that for the corporate domain, so it's good that we can now do that. Moving on to the subject of hardened security. So a number of kind of under the covers changes have been made. Again, little time to go into this in detail, but if you're familiar with Kerberos on Server 2012, the Kerberos ticket granting ticket is your logon token effectively, and it has a lifetime. The lifetime is interesting to us because if it gets stolen by some sort of compromise, it is valid until its lifetime expires. And although we can, under some circumstances, detect replay attacks, it is more convenient if the thing just isn't valid for very long. If you're a very strong admin, so that the attacker would have to get very lucky to steal it while it's still valid. So in 2012, you can only change that on a whole domain basis. You can change the TGT lifetime, but only for the whole domain, which is impractical if you have a large number of users. Now, if you've got Forest Functional Level 2016, we are able to to create a Kerberos TGT based on the length of the escalation, of the time to live of the escalation that our privileged user has gone for. So this means we get a Kerberos ticket that's exactly long enough for the session that the user has requested and not longer. So if you say I want to be an admin for 30 minutes, your Kerberos TGT will be valid for 30 minutes. It works, and the whole group membership thing works by using a new function in ADDS, that's an Active Directory 2016, the expiring links functionality. This means you can create a member link, in other words a member reference, with a time to live. So you say this person is a member of the group with a time to live of 30 minutes. You'll need the PAM, the Privileged Access Management Windows optional feature to do this, but it's basically an enhancement. As soon as your TTL is arrived at, so after 30 minutes, you will no longer be a member of the group. You will automatically be removed from the group, and this is how, in that case, PAM responds to the end of your escalation period. Windows will simply take you out of the group. If you have multiple groups that are time-bound like this, your TGT will respond to the lowest TTL. When you install PAM, it will generate authentication policy silos for the various system accounts that it uses and make them available for you to use for your PAM administrators as well. So the installation scripts grant permissions to the various authentication policy objects in AD, in Priv, so that you can actually create those. And this allows you to provide further limitations on curb ticket lifetimes beyond the group membership constraints that you have. So you are encouraged to use authentication policies to control exactly how your tickets are created. And also under the hardened security topic, we talk about the fact that PAM is now in a position to manage the Priv admins itself, and we just talked about that, but it counts as a hardened security feature as well as a PAM enhancement. Useful to those of us who are increasingly online, cloudy as far as particularly email is concerned. If you're an Office 365 user, it has been frustrating that your MIM service has insisted on having an on-premise Exchange server, or you've only been able to do notifications, so you have been able to do approvals via email if you haven't had an on-premise Exchange server. This is no longer the case, so with Service Pack 1 you can use Exchange Online to mediate the exchange of email messages from the service that says, would you like to approve this request for a group membership or whatever. The user then gets an email saying, please approve this. They can click a button in Outlook, yes, no, and it goes back to the service by email, and that's the mediation of approvals via email. That works then with Exchange Online now, and you simply check the box, use Exchange Online. It knows where the mail servers for Exchange Online are, so it grays out everything else on that dialog that you can see there. And on the next dialog, you simply fill in the username of your Office 365 mailbox that you want to use for your service account and give it a password, and then it's all good. So that just works. Of course, in that case, your MIM server or MIM servers will need internet access directly to Exchange Online to perform their activities, which some people might be slightly nervous about, but if you're that nervous about it, you're probably not using Office 365. The slides will be shared, yes, is the answer to that question. So yes, we shouldn't be too glib about exposing servers to the internet, but it's outbound only and reasonably straightforward to constrain. So without being too flippant about it, we would need internet access, and of course we'd configure that with care, but it shouldn't be the end of the world. So a couple of additional things coming up. It will not have escaped some of your notice that the only binaries available today for MIM SP1 is a full install, which means that you have to uninstall your current MIM to install an SP1 version. I have it on good authority because I spoke to a group product manager the day before yesterday. There will be a hotfix. In other words, there will be a patch effectively available for you just to patch on top of your existing MIM installation with that, so you don't have to do a full uninstall reinstall routine. Not the end of the world to do an uninstall reinstall, but it is a bit more work and slightly more error prone than simply patching in place. So some of you will probably want to wait for an in-place upgrade. That is on its way. Again, nobody's committed to me exactly when that will be, but I imagine it won't be all that long in coming. It's kind of the next thing to do. Is there anything new for the end user or business in MIM versus FIM? So that question, I think, the main end user impact is cross-browser. So if you're a complete Microsoft shop and everyone's got Internet Explorer, then you probably don't have a compelling or you have a replacement portal, like our very beautiful HTML5 portal. If you have the need for cross-browser, cross-platform, though, so if you've got Mac users or Linux users or various tablet-type operating systems, then the additional browser support would be pretty useful for end users. So that kind of is the killer function that would mean that some people will say we need to get to SP1 as soon as possible. As far as if you're a pure Microsoft shop and you're not using Office 365, again, this using Exchange Online is a pretty compelling feature for those of you who have Office 365. Those are kind of the two compelling reasons, I think. Apart from that, I think you can afford to wait. The slides will be available for download, yes, on the OCG Learning site. Okay, I hope that answers all the questions I've seen. Johan, is that good for you? Yeah, that last question about the reasoning behind not being able to update existing, it's simply they've got a full installation package out. They will be releasing a hotfix to do an in-place upgrade. So it's really just a question of timing. There's no reasoning not to do it because they are going to do it. It's just a question of timing. They've done it in, I think, what some of us would consider a slightly odd order. I think some of us expected the hotfix first, but that is the way it is. We have the full bits now, and we'll get a hotfix in. I'm not going to commit to anything, but in the reasonably near future, I imagine. But it is definitely coming. So one last thing, PCNS, the password change notification service, which runs on your AD domain controllers for password synchronization purposes. There is an issue in some customers. It's rare, but it has happened on more than one customer that PCNS after upgrade has failed to start with some root certificate validation error. This has been reported to Microsoft. I've discussed it with them, and they're aware. They are nailing down exactly what the cause of it is, and they will release a fix to the service pack for PCNS when they've nailed it down. All I can say about it at this stage is be aware that that can be an issue, therefore test in your environment, and if you have that issue, then you can continue to use the previous version of PCNS. It still works, by our experience, with the RTM PCNS version. So just so that you're aware, it's a bit of a gotcha there until we get a patch for the PCNS in MIM, and we'll do our best to let you know once that becomes available. All right, we're reaching the end of our time. I'd just like to make you aware of some OCG Learning stuff that's coming up. We have some pretty useful MIM and indeed FIM training courses, which have, I think, come to be seen as the things to attend if you're going to be implementing MIM. So all of these are available either live in various locations. We typically deliver them in the UK or in Seattle, but there are various other locations they pop up occasionally. But they're all available online, so you can attend online remote from your chosen location, and the only thing that matters to you then is the time zone that the course is taking place in, and as I say, there are courses happening in kind of Pacific time and in sort of Greenwich Mean Time as well. We have PAM training. Again, we typically do that online because it's only a one-day course, but for those of you interested in PAM, there is a training course on the 7th of November. We've run it before, and it turns out to be pretty popular, so if you're interested in PAM, then I thoroughly recommend you join that one. And there are other courses available on ocglearning.com, so please do feel free to take a look at that. And then I just open the floor to questions. I'm reading Matthew's more detailed question, which I asked him to post earlier. Second factor. Yes. So we were talking about the fact there isn't any ADFS authentication in the STS for MIM at the moment, and this remains the case. It's on the backlog, and Microsoft are working on it. No timeline for delivery. It is possible, if you're interested, to do particularly remote access from cloud users. You will have to manage shadow accounts to do it, but if you want to use MFA, you can publish it as an Azure app and use Azure App Proxy with Kerberos pre-authentication and Kerberos constrained delegation to get people into it from the cloud. You can bolt cloud MFA onto that. So there's some interesting things there, if that's a must for you, but you already have ADFS and obviously you'd like to use it, I get that. But there it is. So good documentation from us about migration upgrades. To be honest, Microsoft does have pretty good step-by-step upgrade guides. Are you talking FIM 2010 R2 or just RTM? Your best bet is to go to R2 first and then upgrade from there. But they're in-place upgrades. Yeah, it's in-place upgrade. And the usual caveats apply around backups and things, but you'll do an in-place upgrade and then you'll tweak your various configuration files because you get a whole bunch of new .NET versions to deal with, so you'll need to do your .NET mappings to make sure that still works, but that's all pretty well known, to be honest. The Microsoft documentation is good. Our training courses, of course, talk about this stuff in detail, but if you don't want to attend a 4-day or 8-day or 12-day training course for this, then I can recommend some Microsoft documentation for you. We're not holding trainings in India right now, but if any of you know a handful of people in India who'd like one, we do send trainers around the world to do this on-premise for people who want it. All right, we're at the end of our time. I'm not currently seeing any further questions. I just present you with one more poll because I can. They're quite fun. Before you go, I'm just interested in, having seen what you've seen, how do you feel about going to SP1? Just to sort of get a feeling for how the world is seeing it. Okay. Again, there's no absolute requirement for you to answer this question. You can leave at any point. Okay, so I'll leave this slide up there. If you need any further information, do feel free to contact us. There are all sorts of links available to contact us. Contact me directly, or perhaps we'll see you on a training course. So I'll leave the poll up for the time being, but as far as the presentation is concerned, that is that. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much.